Okay, good morning again. We're in the fourth parak of paraks of Maseches Sukkah, as you all know, the parak Lulav Va'arava. And in fact, this parak is very true to its name, in that almost everything we've been discussing so far has been in relation to either the Lulav, in other words, Arba Minim, not necessarily just the Lulav, or the Arava. And here, remember, we're not talking about the Arava, which we place within our Lulav, the one that slots in, but rather the mitzvah of Arava that used to take place in the Beis HaMikdash, which I've shared with you before, where they used to bring these very, very long myrtle branches from the valley below Yerushalayim, take them up into the Beis HaMikdash, and then they used to set them up against the sides of the Mizbeach, these very, very long, 15, 20 foot high branches, myrtle branches. So that was the mitzvah of Arava. And we've heard that there are two characteristics here of these mitzvot. They are different from each other, obviously. The lulav is a different animal, so to speak, or vegetable from the Arava, but they have something in common, also something which distinguishes them. In common, we have the fact that both of them were Dorche Shabbos on one day. That is to say that even though they were, during the time of the Beis HaMikdash, 7-day mitzvot, it was only if Shabbos fell on a certain specific day that mitzvah was done on Shabbos as well. So when it came to the lulav, we said that the lulav was not taken on a Shabbat unless that was the first day of Sukkot. If Shabbat happened to be the first day of Sukkot, as often happens, the lulav was taken in the Beis HaMikdash. If it was another day of Sukkot, and there was a Shabbos Chol HaMoed in between, then it was not taken on that day. It was taken only if Shabbos was the very first day of Sukkot. We also said that there was a problem with the whole mitzvah of lulav, in that there was a risk that people would carry them in the street, take them to shul or to the Beis HaMikdash, and then violate the Isam Torah of carrying, essentially violate one of the melachot of Shabbat. And that was a risk. And that really reduced the number of occasions in which they were allowed to take lulav and esrog. But on the first day, this was permitted. When it came to the Arava, the mitzvah Arava, where these large myrtle branches were set against the sides of the Mizbeach, I showed you a picture, and we'll have a look at that again later on, there was also one particular day on which it would be taken even if it were a Shabbat. And that was on the seventh day, not the first day. Very much a contrast. So there was only one day again where it would be taken on Shabbat, but Shabbat had to be the seventh day. If Shabbat was the first day or any other day, then the Arava mitzvah, which otherwise would have been a daily mitzvah, was not done. It was only done on Shabbat if Shabbat was the seventh day. And in the Gemara, the discussion dealt with why these were so, why it was the first day that was a special day for lulav and esrog, that it was taken even on that day if it was in Shabbat, and for the Arava it was the seventh day. The Gemara had remarked that really, when it comes to the Arava, there is no real fear of carrying on Shabbat, because the mitzvah of Arava was really done by the Kohanim only in the Beis HaMikdash, and it would have been taken up on the Friday afternoon before Shabbat, and the Kohanim can be relied on not to make a mistake. It wasn't done by 5 million Israelis. It was done by a very small, select and elite bunch of Kohanim, and they would have known the halacha. So there's no fear, really, that they would come to make a mistake. And therefore, in theory, it could have been allowed for any day that Shabbat fell, because there was never any fear of carrying. But if it had been allowed on other days, whenever Shabbat fell, it would make it look as though the mitzvah Rava, which is halacha l'Moshe Sinai, was a more serious and heavy one than even the mitzvah of lulav, because the mitzvah of lulav, you only take the lulav on Shabbat if it's the first day. If we actually did the mitzvah Rava on Shabbat any day, it would almost make it look as though the Arava trumps the mitzvah of lulav in terms of its weight, in terms of its importance. They didn't want that to be the case. So therefore they said it will only be, we can only use it on Shabbat if it falls on the seventh day. Why the seventh day? So here the Gemara said, well, it could have been the first day. Why do we actually want to display it on Shabbat at all? The Gemara gave us something very interesting. It is a mitzvah for all 7 days, but maybe is an inyan of muktzah involved, even with the myrtle branches. It might have been better to have avoided the mitzvah on Shabbat, even on the seventh day. But the Chazal wanted to make a point. Remember, I gave you this description of those two deviant sects in Judaism, the Baitus and Sodok, both Thusians and the Sadducees, didn't really believe in anything that wasn't specifically in the Torah. And they had no time really for what they considered to be the minhag of the Arava, because they couldn't find it in the Chumash anyway, unlike Lulav and Esrog. Therefore, they had no time for it. So the Chazal, taking the Perushim, the Pharisaic view, wanted to emphasize its the strength of the Masoris of the Torah Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, that it does have the weight of the Torah mitzvah. And therefore they said, we wish this to be done on a Shabbos, on one Shabbos at least, simply to show the fact that this is considered by us to be a Torah law. Maybe not by the Sadducees, but by us it is. And therefore we will take on a Shabbos, which shows its weight and its severity, that you even do it on a Shabbos. Why did they choose the seventh day rather than the first day, which is what we choose for Lulav, when we say you take the Lulav even if it falls on Shabbat? Because if they had made it the first day, it would look as though we were just paralleling the din of Lulav. Lulav is taken on the first day, even if it's on a Shabbat in the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore they said, well, that's why we chose to take the Arava on the first day as well, to differentiate the Lulav and the Arava, to show that the Arava had a particular reason for it to be taken on Shabbos. In order to dispute the Sadducees, a different day was marked out when you would take it, even if it wasn't Shabbat. And if you're not going to take it on the first day, if it's not going to be first day, what other special day are you going to have? The seventh day, the bookends of Yom Tov. You know, we often have Yom Tov on the first day and on the last day. So therefore, they said the special day on which Arava will even be Docha Shabbos, even put Shabbos aside, is going to be the seventh day. Okay, so this is a rather long, this is the way we went last week. We went around all those discussions. So on the seventh day, even if that seventh day on Shabbat is a Shabbat, we would take the Arava. All the other days being weekdays, it would be taken anyway. But if the seventh day was a Shabbat, it would be taken on the seventh day as well. Okay, that sort of takes us to where we were through the discussion. And we need to keep some of these things in mind as we go in further, although we will have time to make various detours of interest. Okay, I'm going to take you on your sheet or on your Gemara page to the 13th line down from Mem Gimel Omid Base, 43b, 13th line down. We'll go over a few little things that we did the previous occasion, and then we'll move forward. The line begins with the word lamed hey, and we're going to take it from the third word from the end of that line, I hachi ha'idna, I. So the Gemara wants to say towards the end of the 13th line from the top, I hachi ha'idna nami letchi. Here the Gemara it's within this tangle of discussion, but we've got up to the point that we need to be. The Gemara had said that when it comes to the Arava, there isn't really a fear that the Arava is going to be violating Shabbos, because the Arava was done specially by the Kohanim, etc., etc. And therefore, there's no risk that the ordinary man in the street will carry the Arava through the street. So therefore, we don't really have a fear about taking the Arava on Shabbat, that anybody will be Mechalel Shabbat as a result of it. So the Gemara asks now, if that is the so, that we there is no reason to prevent the Arava being taken on the seventh day if it falls on a Shabbat, and we're not fearful of the violation of the Malacha of Shabbos, ha'idnanami litchi. Why don't we do the same today, says the Gemara. The Gemara's today is maybe 1800 years ago. But why don't we do the same today and take the Arava on the seventh day if it falls on a Shabbat? Which they didn't at the time of the Gemara. They did not do it. If we're now saying there's no real fear of the violation of Shabbat, why was it only done at the time of the Beis HaMikdash and not now? Are we making a Zeichel HaMikdash? We make a Zeichel HaMikdash even for Lulav. Lulav is not min HaTorah outside Yerushalayim, the Beis HaMikdash, other than on the first day, but we all take it all days in order to commemorate what was done. Why don't we, says the Amoram, after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, also take the Arava on the seventh day, Zeichel HaMikdash? It's not as if we're worried about carrying through the streets. As we said, the Arava doesn't have that problem. So I mentioned last time over here, there's an outstanding question on this piece of Gemara. Because even at the time of the Amoram, what kind of mitzvah of Arava was there? What kind of mitzvah of Arava do we have today? Well, what are we talking about? At the time of the Beis HaMikdash, there was the specific mitzvah involving the Kohanim, and they would take out these large 15 feet Aravot branches from Motzah, bring them up to Yerushalayim, and then they would set them around the Mizbeach. What's the commemoration event that we do for the mitzvah Aravah? The Gemara is saying, why don't we do the same today? What do they mean? Do what today? So that what we might think is we're referring to is on Hoshana Rabbah, when we bash the Arava. We bash an Arava. It's not the 15-foot Arava that we were talking about at the time of Beis HaMikdash, but it's a special mitzvah of Arava. It's not the Arava in the Lulav. It's a separate Arava. And we don't do it on a Shabbos. In other words, the Gemara really means to say, why can't Hoshana Rabbah fall on a Shabbos? It's just written in different language. That seventh day, which is Hoshana Rabbah, which in a sense commemorates the mitzvah Rabbah and the Beis HaMikdash, why can't it be on a Shabbos? That's what the Gemara is asking. Now, as we'll see later on, this mitzvah of the Arava that we today do, where we first of all, we go 7 times around the bima. And what do? We go around with a lulav and esrog, not with an Arava. And then at the end, we just hit 5 times on the ground or whatever your minhag is, and you say a few words, and that's it. That's nothing like the mitzvah of Arava and the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so let's hold that question back. Let's just assume that is in some way a weak commemoration of the mitzvah of Arava, Hoshana Rabbah that we have today. Why doesn't it fall on the Shabbos as well? That's what the Gemara is asking over here. Tosfos brings up a question which is startlingly simple and obvious over here. What is the Gemara saying over here? Isn't this a nonsensical question? Why don't we do it today? The answer is obvious. We said that the reason we would allow the mitzvah Rabbah, the time of the Beis HaMikdash, to be Doche Shabbos was that it was only done by the Kohanim. They're the only ones, and they're very careful. But who does the mitzvah Rabbah today? If we imagine Hoshana Rabbah is the commemoration, every one of us. It's like the lulav and esrog. So if we allowed it on a Shabbos, there would be 5 million Jews taking their Rabbah, maybe a few of them violating the Shabbos on the way. But that's why we don't make it fall on the seventh day, surely. If our commemoration was a commemoration where only one individual or a group of Kohanim did it, then the question would be a good question. But the Gemara is asking a question that doesn't make sense, because there is a real fear, since we are all doing the commemoration of the Arava, that we will be taking Arava through the streets. If Hoshana Rabbah wasn't a Shabbos, then some people might be carrying it through the streets where there's no Erev. So what's the Gemara's question? Why don't we do it today? So there's no good answer to this. It's one of these questions that stumps everyone learning this piece of Gemara. Rashi already anticipates the question, and he brings an answer, but Tosfos says this answer is highly unlikely, but unfortunately, he doesn't really give an answer himself. He just says, I don't like Rashi's answer. What's Rashi's answer? Rashi's answer is this. We should today, if you like, or in the time of the Amoram 1700 years ago, allow the Arava to be taken on Shabbos, but in a special way. During the week, if it fell on during a weekday, then Hoshana Rabbah would be done by all of us 5 million Israelis taking our Aravos individually through the street. But maybe we should say today, at least make some sort of pale reminder of Shabbos Hoshana Rabbah. And therefore, when allow Hoshana Rabbah to fall on a Shabbos, and if it falls on a Shabbos, then individuals won't carry their arabot for clapping, if you like, to shul, but only maybe the gabbai, only the Rosh Beis, only, I don't want the chief rabbi will do it, and he will do it as, if you like, the shliach on behalf of everyone else in Klal Yisrael. There's a startling suggestion here in Rashi that essentially what is an individual mitzvah, if it falls on any other day, would become somehow a mitzvah carried out by someone on behalf of the rest of the Jewish people. Only on Hoshana Rabbah that falls on Shabbos. But at least let's do that. That's the way Rashi understands it. And then that would be fine, because that would be like the case of the Kohanim. We would trust Rabbi Wein not to carry his araba through the street, right? If he's going to, he's not going to make that mistake. If it's only one Rav in each shul, even better. If it's only one rabbi in the whole country doing it, then he's not going to carry it through the streets, and that would be fine. Let's allow Hoshana Rabbah. Let's say that if Hoshana Rabbah falls on a Shabbos, then the chief rabbi does it on behalf of everyone else. Not surprisingly, that Tosfos finds this a startling suggestion in Rashi, but because he doesn't give a better answer himself, I'm afraid we're stuck with Rashi's question, with Rashi's answer, or simply not understanding the Gemara's question. So they say sometimes, what do they say in Yiddish? One doesn't die from a kasha. You know, one wonders and ponders and then goes on and finishes one's porridge. And that's what we need to do under these circumstances. Nevertheless, the Gemara does ask this question. However, whether you want to say the answers like Rashi or just say you don't understand the question, the Gemara's question, it was simply this. If we're not worried about carrying through the streets for the Arava, because we said we weren't at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, so what's different today? Maybe our commemoration of the Arava, Hoshana Rabbah, on the 7th day of Sukkot should also be allowed on Shabbos. We should celebrate it the same way as if it were a weekday, Hoshana Rabbah. Now, you will know that Hoshana Rabbah never falls on a Shabbos, but we will see that only in a moment. The Gemara does not know this, if you imagine, at the moment. It imagines Hoshana Rabbah can fall on a Shabbos. However, we don't take the Arava if it happens. Why don't we allow it to be taken, said the Gemara. If it falls on a Shabbos through the calendar, then we should allow the Arava to be taken. That was the Gemara's question. So the Gemara's answer is, you're right. If we really knew what the 7th day was, we would do it. We come back to this answer. We don't know which is the 7th day. What? Says the Gemara, Anan lo yad inon b'kivua deyarcha. So we don't know the actual date of Rosh Chodesh in reality. So the Gemara here is harking to the time when they used these signals, if you like, to try and announce when Rosh Chodesh was for the beginning of the month. So the beginning of the month of Tishri would be announced because the Eidim would come to Yerushalayim and they would say they'd seen the moon. Having said they'd seen the moon, Rosh Chodesh would be announced for that day, and they would try to get the message through out Eretz Yisrael and also to Chutz La'aretz, particularly Bovel, where there are large numbers of Jews. Now, as long as you know when Rosh Chodesh has been set, you know which is the 7th day of Sukkot. The 7th day of Sukkot is going to be the 22nd of the month, or whatever. But if it takes a long time for the news to come through, then you're left with a Sfeika Diyoma, not being 100% sure. So the Gemara says, since we in Bovel don't know exactly when Rosh Chodesh for the month was, then we have got a suffix, as we know. We don't know whether the 4th day is the 4th day or the 3rd day, or the 5th day is the 5th day or the 4th day. So the 7th day could be the 7th day or the 6th day. So just because it's the 7th day, maybe it's really the 6th day. And therefore, they didn't want to allow it to be taken on Shabbos. We don't take it on Shabbos today, says the Gemara, in its today of the Gemara, because we can't be sure which is the 7th day. We are only going to allow the Arava to be taken as it was in the Beis HaMikdash on the definite 7th day, if it falls on a Shabbos. Since we don't know which is the definite 7th day, therefore, we simply can't take it. We will not allow Shabbos to violate another day which isn't the 7th day. We're not going to allow, the mitzvah to to be done on a day which may not be Shabbos. It may just be Friday. It may be that the real seventh day is tomorrow rather than today, if you like, because of this Sveka Diyam. And for that reason, we don't take it. If we really knew what was the seventh day, and we would do it, but we don't really know. That's what the Gemara is saying over here, because of this suffix, because we rely on the signals coming through. Today, we don't rely on the signals coming through, but we maybe think about that a little bit later. But we're talking about the Gemara, and therefore they weren't able to allow it to be taken on the seventh day if it was an uncertain seventh day in Baba. The Gemara now asks the obvious question: in who the Yodi bekivu adiyacha letche? Says the Gemara. But what about them, our colleagues in Eretz Yisrael? The time the Gemara asks these questions in Babel, there were many sages in Eretz Yisrael, as we know. The Talmud Yerushalmi was based upon the debates of many great Amoraim in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish, all these great Amoraim lived in Eretz Yisrael, and at the same time there were the academies in Babel. So the Gemara is saying, okay, you've explained why we in Babel don't take it if Shabbos falls on the seventh day, because we don't know for sure it's the seventh day, so we won't take the Arava. But in Eretz Yisrael, they know which is the seventh day because they're within signal range, and certainly in Yerushalayim, they'll know within minutes which day is Rosh Chodesh. So they should take it. If the seventh day, they know is the seventh day, and it's Shabbos, they should take the Arava commemoration, the Hoshana Rabbah look-alike, if you like, because we're talking about after the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed. But nevertheless, in Eretz Yisrael, they will know which is Rosh Chodesh as a commemoration that they take it even on Shabbos on the definite seventh day. That's what the Gemara is asking over here. There's no ambiguity in Eretz Yisrael, and we know that they don't. Right? If the answer is they did, that's fine, but we know they don't, says the Amoraim. They're saying, we know, and our colleagues in Eretz Yisrael also don't take it. On Hoshana Rabbah falls on a Shabbos, they won't take it. They never take it on a Shabbos. So why not? They know which is the seventh day. Let's commemorate how it was done in the Beis Hamikdash, where it was taken on the seventh day. The Arava ceremony was done on the seventh day. So the Gemara now answers, very interesting. This is where you get some really interesting historical stuff. Ki asa bar Hedya ama loikla. When Bar Hedya came down from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he told the Babylonian Amoraim that it never falls on a Shabbos. In other words, the seventh day never falls on a Shabbos. So if you say, why don't they take it when the seventh day falls on a Shabbos in Eretz Yisrael? The answer is because the seventh day never falls on a Shabbos in Eretz Yisrael. Well, Shabbos never falls on the seventh day in Eretz Yisrael. Why not? Haven't we just said it all depends upon witnesses? Surely it's a 1 in 7 chance that Hoshana Rabbah could fall on a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, or whatever it is, could fall on Shabbos as well. How can you say that on a witness-based Rosh Chodesh sanctification that Hoshana Rabbah would never fall on a Shabbos? The answer is because, as we explained briefly last week, they had a hybrid system. They didn't just follow the Eidim. They followed the Eidim in terms of determining which was, if you like, the astronomical Rosh Chodesh. They asked the questions of the Eidim, and they gave them a fanfare and a big meal and a champagne bottle and sent them home again for coming to Yerushalayim to give the testimony of the new moon. But ultimately, the decision on Rosh Chodesh also required them to take other factors into account. And there were many other factors they would take into account. And if necessary, they would say today is Rosh Chodesh, despite the fact the Eidim say it is, but we will hold it over for tomorrow, like a 2-day Rosh Chodesh. We will make tomorrow Rosh Chodesh to avoid something they wish to avoid. So Bar Hedya is really saying that in Eretz Yisrael, even if it astronomically fell on the Shabbos based upon Eidim, nevertheless, the Beis Din would always say, hey, according to the day being Rosh Chodesh, Hoshana Rabbah is going to be on a Shabbos. We don't like it. We're going to make Rosh Chodesh tomorrow, so Hoshana Rabbah falls on a Sunday. That's the way Bar Hedya is explaining it. They deliberately moved Rosh Chodesh to the next day, which they're entitled to do as long as they haven't actually announced Rosh Chodesh to be on a certain day and said Mekudesh. Rosh Chodesh is based upon the decision of the Beis Din. The Beis Din uses the Eidim to determine which it should be, and then is able to take other factors into account. And in Eretz Yisrael, they took those other factors into account. And for whatever reason, they decided they did not want the seventh day, Hoshana Rabbah, to fall on a Shabbos. Some say because they themselves didn't like the idea that since they were only doing a weak impression of the real ceremony in the Beis HaMikdash with these giant Aravas, that people would take Aravas and they would, there might be an Indian of Muktzah involved over here, and maybe also because of this carrying, because everyone did it separately. And as you say, it was just the chief rabbi who did it. They didn't want this to happen, and therefore they deliberately avoided Hoshana Rabbah falling on a Shabbos. And that's the answer to the question, why don't in Eretz Yisrael then take it and falls on Shabbos? Because the Beis Din didn't want it to fall on a Shabbos. That's by Hedja. Let's just go on for a moment, because we find something very strange. The next piece, the Gemara now goes on to say, Ki osa Rovin v'chol nechuti omri ikla. So you have Rovin and the other nechutim. Bahedja was also one of the nechutim. Nechutim means Yordim, those who came down from Eretz Yisrael to Babel. They would go backwards and forwards, as we explained, and they would somehow fertilize the Torah of Eretz Yisrael with the Torah of Babel. There were great sages in Eretz Yisrael. There were great sages in Babel. And they didn't have WhatsApp in terms of discussion groups, but instead groups of Amoram who would travel and be on the road most of the time would bring the Torah of Eretz Yisrael to Babel and the Torah of Babel to Eretz Yisrael. Quite remarkable situation. It was like an intellectual exchange between the two sets of academies. And we've mentioned Bar Hedja, and we'll learn more about Bar Hedja in a moment because he's one of the most interesting characters in the whole of Talmud Bavli. But the Gemara then went on to say when Rovin was a well-known Nechutei. He spent his time going up and down, up and down. He was a Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan when he was in Eretz Yisrael, but he spent a lot of time in Bavel, also giving over the Torah he heard from Rabbi Yochanan in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yochanan was one of the head of the Yerushalmi Academy, if you like, in Eretz Yisrael. And by the way, the Talmud Yerushalmi has nothing to do with Yerushalayim. They were way out of Yerushalayim. It was called Yerushalmi. It was really written and put together in Tiberia. That's where the Talmud Yerushalmi really was. But it has this name Yerushalmi. It would be better be called Eretz Yisrael Talmud. So Robin and his colleagues, when they came from Eretz Yisrael to Babel, they disagreed with Bar Hedja. And they said, what are you talking about? Maybe they didn't have this direct dialogue, but the Gemara reports it. And they said, of course it happened. It happened frequently. It was a 1 in 7 chance. They did not put off Rosh Chodesh to the next day. If the Hoshana Rabbah would have fallen on Shabbos, they said it like it was, and they made it Rosh Chodesh. But what happens velo dochi? They merely told people they should not take a Rabbah on the 7th day. That's all. They said they should not take a Rabbah on the 7th day, but it did happen. So we have over here an interesting machlokas between two sets of travelers, if you like, reporting what was going on in Eretz Yisrael, reporting on what seems to be a very basic fact. Did the Sanhedrin in Eretz Yisrael allow Hoshana Rabbah to fall on a Shabbos, or did they not allow it to fall on a Shabbos? You'd have thought there was only one right answer, really. We're talking about a reality. It's not a theoretical fact. It's a practical fact. But there's a machlokas over here, which itself is very interesting. Let me take you a little bit into Bar Hedja. Bar Hedja, as I said to you, was one of the most interesting characters in the whole Gemara. Shall I go to Bar Hedja first? Or shall I take you first on the Noach? No, just before I go into the biography of Bar Hedja, which is a bit of a technical thing, I want to work with you through a whole Tosfos, which starts in our Gemara with the Lo Ikla. I'll share my screen, and if I share my screen, hopefully, second. This Tosfos you see over here, Lo, which you can see on the page, Lo Ikla, is the same as you have on the right-hand column of your Gemara in the middle of the page, Lo Ikla. Instead of being in Rashi print, it is in square print. I'm afraid it's not punctuated, so I haven't gone all the way to make life easy for you. This is a very remarkable Tosfos, which is about the extent to which the Rabbonim took into account in their announcement of Rosh Chodesh whether to avoid something or not. We just talked about whether they set Rosh Chodesh this next day because they didn't want Hoshana Rabbah to fall on the Shabbos. So let's have a look. What about Rosh Hashanah? Not wanting it to fall on the Shabbos, the first day, etc. Do we try to avoid these things as well? What was done in the calendar, in the calendarization, if you like, to ensure that certain dates would not occur on the Shabbos? So let's follow this Tosfos and see what he says. Lo ikla. This was by Hedja. Behedja said Lo ikla, it never happened. It never happened that the seventh day of Sukkot Hoshana Rabbah fell on the Shabbos because somehow it was avoided to. It was avoided by the Chazal. It was avoided by the Sanhedrin. When they declared Rosh Chodesh, they ensured to do so that if it looked as though it would occur on the Shabbos, they added another day and so that it would occur on the Sunday instead to avoid the Shabbos. Says Tosfos. Lo ikla didn't happen. Why? Shahoyim ma'avrin elul or echad min haradoshim kishahoyu roim she'ire b'Shabbos shvi'i shel harava. Because they would add an extra day into Elul. In other words, they put in a second day of Rosh Chodesh, so that Tishri started a bit later. In order, when they saw that the witnesses' testimony would have made Rosh Chodesh fall such that the seventh day was on a Shabbos, they added another day. V'hochi Amar Yerushalmi, and this is what we find also in Talmud Yerushalmi. Rabbi Simon, and this is in Aramaic. The Gemara is now going to quote the Yerushalmi, and the Yerushalmi, not the Gemara. Tosfos is going to quote Talmud Yerushalmi. We read in Talmud Bavli, but the Tosfos is going to quote the Yerushalmi, which he sometimes does, and we will see that Yerushalmi follows Bar Hedya, which itself is going to be interesting, because we said Ravin and everyone else said that it did happen, that this Hoshana Rabbah fell on the Shabbos. Bar Hedya is on his own, saying it didn't happen, and we'll see that Yerushalmi agrees with Bar Hedya, agrees with one individual against everyone else. And Yerushalmi is the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael. So essentially, we have to say Bar Hedya was right. It's not a matter of opinion anymore. If the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Yerushalmi scholars, not some floating scholars who go from Babel to Eretz Yisrael and back again, but the Yerushalmi scholars, and it was edited by Rabbi Yochanan, who was the greatest of the sages in the second generation of Amoron. If he was to agree with this fact in the Yerushalmi that Hoshana Rabbah doesn't fall on the Shabbos, Bar Hedya is right and everyone else is wrong. Okay, let's see how this goes on. It gets more surprising as we go along. Hachi Amar Yerushalmi, Rabbi Simon, he's the name of obviously one of the Amoron in Eretz Yisrael, the name. Rabbi Simon is Simon, right? So he had a good name, as we would recognize today. Mefakit le'ilm de mechashvin, he would instruct those who would determine which day would be Rosh Chodesh and how the calendar should be worked. Havun datchen, set your minds, de lo osi takaitu b'shabta, that Tekiah Shofar doesn't fall on the Shabbos. Make sure that the first day of Rosh Hashanah is not a Shabbos. Well, it is nowadays, isn't it? Very often. He instructed them at the time of the Yerushalmi, ensure that you add an extra day into Elul, just so that the first day of Rosh Hashanah falls on a Sunday rather than a Shabbos. In the same way as we said we might want to do this for the seventh day of Sukkot. And also, and also that this means Hoshana Rabbah, the Arava day, shouldn't fall on Shabbos either. And now listen to this, and if you feel under pressure, because everything that you hear from the witnesses and other things and the various other considerations, Abdun Takaita, then you can be mevater, if you like, and allow the first day of Rosh Hashanah to fall on a Shabbos. V'lo ta'avdun arvata, but don't, under any circumstances, allow Hoshana Rabbah to fall on Shabbos. And Tosfos remarks, isn't this crazy? Mashma dechaish tvei yom harava mitchiyat shofar v'lulav. This suggests that at the time of Eretz Yisrael, they were more concerned about Hoshana Rabbah falling on a Shabbos, as if it were more dangerous than they were of Tekiyah Shava falling on Shabbos. When Tekiyah Shava falls on a Shabbos, they were not going to blow the shofar. They were going to miss the whole mitzvah of Tekiyah Shofar. If the first day of Sukkot falls on a Shabbos, then you're not going to take lulav and esrog. That's another mitzvah in our Torah. And therefore, and he's saying to them, never mind. If it really works out that the first day of Rosh Hashanah and the first day of Sukkot falls on a Shabbos, let it happen. Even though I don't want it to happen, but let it happen. But under no circumstances ever let Hoshana Rabbah fall on a Shabbos. It makes Hoshana Rabbah sound like the most important day of the year. But you really don't want it to fall on the Shabbos because somebody might come to take the Arovas and whatever. Don't let it fall on Shabbos at all. Because you don't want to miss the mitzvah arava. If it falls on a Shabbos, you won't take the arava. So therefore, don't let it fall on a Shabbos. We are so, if you like, fachnokit to make the arava work out not on the Shabbos. We're not fachnokit at all about losing the whole mitzvah of shofar. Isn't that strange? And Tosfos goes on to say the gam achshav, even now, anu machashvin. That's what I'm telling you. We make sure that Hoshana Rabbah doesn't fall on the Shabbos, even now in our calculated calendar. Because already Tosfos is living during the calculated calendar. We've got three eras over here. We've got the time when it was by Adam, we've got the time in the Beis HaMikdash when it was done by Adam, and then you've got the people who had the signals when they were Adam, then you've got afterwards, you've got the calculated calendar. It's rather complicated. For Ashofar V'Lulav, Lo Chai Shinam. It doesn't seem to be worried about the fact that if Rosh Hashanah falls on a Shabbos or the first day of Sukkot, that you abandon a mitzvah min HaTorah. He's not so worried about that, but he's very worried about abandoning the mitzvah Rabbah. So he says, don't let it happen on a Shabbos. Okay. Afal Pi, as he says, Sheyom Rishon D'Oraisa. The Tema, the Ayom, goes on to say, the Ayom. I think he means, sorry, I've got to do something over here. What's happened over here is that I've got a bug in the program. Okay. Yom HaRava, Shehu Zeicha LeMikdash. The whole reason of Hoshana Rabbah is only Zeicha LeMikdash anyway. We don't have a mitzvah in our Torah of Arava nowadays anyway. It was only really done in the Beis HaMikdash with these giant Aravas. And look how careful we are to make sure that it doesn't fall on the Shabbos so that we don't miss out a day. Isn't that very strange? Wait a second. On the very important mitzvahs like shofar, we don't care if we miss them out. So it would seem. That's what the Gemara finds surprising. So he goes on to say, maybe we have to say that's the case. Tosfos gives an answer which is like a lateral thinking answer. It could well be the case. He says that we are less concerned about Rosh Hashanah falling the Shabbos and missing the mitzvah of blowing shofar than we are about a Rabbah. You know why? Because sometimes we have to make a firmer fence around those things that are weaker than around those things that are stronger. If we miss out Tekiyah Shofar one year because it falls on a Shabbos, it's not gefährlich. It's not terrible. Why not? Because we'll do it next year and the year after and the year after and the year after. However, if because Hoshana Rabbah falls on Shabbos, we don't take the Arava, then because the Arava is not such a serious mitzvah, people might come and abandon it altogether. Therefore, this is the ultimate irony, those things that are less important, but are just rabbinic, need stronger emphasis and protection than those things that are more important and min HaTorah. This is one of those about faces you sometimes see in the Gemara, that Chazal make the protection around a drabonon stronger than around something min HaTorah. The Torah doesn't need protection. No one's going to say, hey, we didn't do this mitzvah last year. That means the mitzvah doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, we didn't blow shofar last year because the first day wasn't a Shabbos, so therefore maybe there's no dinner to hear shofar. It's all been abandoned. It was a one-year wonder. We don't say that. Everybody will take it the next year. But on a mitzvah which doesn't seem to be so significant, if we don't do it 1 year because it falls on a Shabbos. And next year, even if it doesn't fall on the Shabbos, the 7th day doesn't fall on the Shabbos, we may also decide, well, we didn't do last year, and it's not so important, so let's not do it again. That's the answer Tosfos gives. 1 second. And the other thing he says is, at least in Kriyas Shofar, we don't blow the shofar on the first day, we blow it on the second day. Actually, Kriyas Shofar is only 1 day, again, but nevertheless, we blow it again on the second day, really, anyway, so we don't entirely lose the mitzvah. That's what he wants to say. Let's see anything else. Okay, so that's basically Tosfos. So Tosfos is saying over here that the Yerushalmi tells us, like Bar Hedya, that it didn't fall on a Shabbos because it was planned that way. And he's told us more, says Tosfos told us even more, that the importance of making sure that Hoshana Rabbah doesn't fall on a Shabbos even exceeded the importance for the Beis Din when they considered how to fix the calendar for Rosh Hashanah. They were less concerned about losing Kriyas Shofar because Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos than they were concerned about losing the mitzvah Rava because our Rava falls on Shabbos. That's what Tosfos has added over here. But we said this was a machlokas, and it was a machlokas between Bar Hedya and the other Nechutim. Tosfos said the answers like Bar Hedya, but the other Nechutim said it did fall on the Shabbos. But Chazal said, don't take the Arava if it falls on Shabbos. But the calendar, they didn't take any tactics to avoid it falling on a Shabbos. If the Eidim came and the 22nd of the month, based upon their testimony, will be a Shabbos, they said, let it be a Shabbos, but don't do the mitzvah Rava on the day. That was what the others said. Bar Hedya said it just never happened that way because we conspire with a calendar to make sure it doesn't happen that way. So who's this Bar Hedya? Now, it's just interesting because Bar Hedya comes in, particularly the Gemara and Brachos, in the last parak of Brachos. Anyone who's done Brachos or who's done Daf Yomi will remember the famous Bar Hedya. So in the last parak, the Gemara talks about dreams and the interpretation of dreams. And there are page upon pages describing various dreams and how they can be interpreted. What happens if a posuk comes into your head and it's a posuk that seems, it frightens you, it just comes into your head. How do you interpret a posuk? What happens if you hear a child say something which makes your hair stand on end? There are various mental protections you should have. How do you cope with a bad dream? What do you do with a bad dream? And the Gemara says there were many dream interpreters in Yerushalayim, and it was a profession at the time to be a dream interpreter. Now, one famous interpreter, lived a little bit later on actually, was Bar Hedya. So this very Bar Hedya character, who we learn about over here, traveling between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel, and he brings the news that it never happened, that Hoshana Rabbah falls on a Shabbos, and Yerushalmi agrees with him, and not like all his colleagues. This very same Bar Hedya had another profession. He was a professional dream interpreter. And the Gemara actually spends almost an onward discussing his interpretations, particularly for 2 Amoram in Bavel, Abaye and Rava. When he came up to Bavel, obviously he must have earned a handsome living, and maybe he needed it because he was taking first-class travel between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel because he was a Nechut. He was paying for his fares. I don't know who was paying for his fares. So he was a paid dream interpreter. And if people had dreams, they would come to him and they would ask him what it meant, whether they had to take evasive action, whether it was a good omen, whether it was a bad omen, etc. And the Gemara says that when Abaye came to him, and Abaye used to pay for his dream interpretations, and he used to pay handsomely, all of the dreams that Abaye placed before Bar Hedya was able to interpret them to the good, to the benefit of Abaye. No matter how hair-raising the dream really looked, right? You have a dream about storms, and then he would interpret it in such a way to show it was a bit like, I might say, a storm in a teacup, but it wasn't really a storm at all, but it was something about a great brainwave or something. He had a way of interpreting all the dreams of Abaye, the Tova. And that's how they came out. Essentially, they were correctly interpreted to the benefit of Abaye. So Abaye felt it was worthwhile paying him because, every time he came and he'd had a dream that concerned him, the interpreter was able to interpret it to his benefit, to his future benefit. You would normally only go to a dream interpreter if you had a bad dream. You have a good dream, you're not worried about it. If you're troubled by a dream, you go to a dream interpreter who will perhaps help you on your way to dealing with a dream. So it was a bit of a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a person in contact with the spirits, and who knows what else as well. So that was Abaye. Now Rava also had lots of dreams. It seems both the Abaye and Rava, both two Amoraim who debate with each other frequently in the Gemara and know each other very well. Rava also had many dreams, but Rava wasn't so well endowed with money, and he wasn't able to pay Bar Hedya. And all the interpretations he got from Bar Hedya were to his shock. They were all bad interpretations of what would happen, right? They were all omens of impending destruction. He lost his wife, he lost his this. It was like Eov. It was like the pains of Job, the suffering of Job he went through. Every time he had a bad dream, he went to Bar Hedya, and it was interpreted badly. In other words, Rava felt that these were the true interpretations of Bar Hedya. They happened in practice, and therefore Bar Hedya was only telling him what the intrinsic dream had to say, and it was no fault of Bar Hedya at all. He was saddened by it because he led a miserable existence, whereas Abaye seemed to be quite a charmed existence, because even his bad dreams seemed to have a good outcome after Bar Hedya interpreted them. Rava accepted the bad with the good, so to speak, and he just suffered. The Gemara says that one day Rava and Bar Hedya were on a boat together, and Rava had another bad dream, and he asked him about this particular dream. And then suddenly a piece of paper or a notebook of Bar Hedya dropped to the ground. And Rava picked up this notebook, and it had this headline, strapline on it: Kol ha-chalomos holchin acha hapeh. All the dreams, their outcomes follow the interpretation. In other words, the outcome of a dream is not fixed by the dream, but by the interpretation given to the dream. It's a shocking thought, really. So in other words, if you can have a certain dream, if you go to an interpreter who interprets it to your benefit, then that will be the outcome. If you go to a dream interpreter who interprets it to your horror, then you will have a horrific outcome, because it's the interpretation that determines the outcome. When he saw that, he raged at Bar Hedya. He said, all these years I've been coming to you, and you could have interpreted them to my benefit, and you didn't. I happen to know that all the interpretations you gave to Abaye, my colleague, were to his benefit, and they ended up, was all, happily ever after in terms of the outcomes. All the interpretations you gave me were negative, and the outcomes were negative. In other words, you conspired to make my existence as miserable as it is. And he says, I will never forgive you for this. And he gave Bar Hedya a klola. It was a pretty horrible klola, and Bar Hedya had a bad end. And he was eventually tortured or whatever it is by the authorities who didn't like what he'd said in some other context as a result of the klola of Rava. And why did this happen? Because Rava wasn't paying him. Rava wasn't paying him. Anyone who paid him got a good interpretation, hence a good outcome. Anyone who didn't pay him got a bad interpretation, hence a bad outcome. And this is a very interesting piece of Gemara. What do you see from here? Bar Hedya, you have to say, was a rogue. But this rogue, at the same time, was one of these Nechutim who came up and down from Eretz Yisrael. And he was right as far as this, his memory of Hoshana Rabbah falling to Shabbos. The Yerushalmi sides with his interpretation rather than those of Ravina and all the other great pious scholars. So there's a lot of irony in here as well. But this is Bar Hedya. I wanted to share with you some interesting snippets over here, which I found. Just make this bigger. Can you see this? There's a sefer called Bar Hedia. Why would you call a sefer Bar Hedia? This Bar Hedia was a bit of a scoundrel dream interpreter who's just happened to come into our Gemara to do with Rosh Chodesh, etc., etc. Look at the name of this book, Sefer Bar Hedia, O Chalom Herzl. The book known as Bar Hedia, or alternatively, Herzl's Dream. Dream, Bar Hedia, dream interpreter. This book was written in 1899. This is at the time of, around the time of these great conferences which Theodor Herzl was running, of the Zionist congresses. And it was written by someone called Dov Berish ben Alexander Tursh. So he was a journalist and polemicist. He was a very frum guy, you can imagine. He was, you might say he was Haredi. They didn't use the word Haredim at the time. This is us going back in time. He was a totally observant, a scholar and journalist and polemicist. And he was completely verbissen against Theodor Herzl's Zionism. Not so much for religious reasons. He considered Herzl to be a wild dreamer, and his ambitions for a state of Israel, which would be recognized by the nations and which, the Jews will be able to flock back to, was completely a crazy dream. And he may have had some crazy dreams, and he was interpreting them his way, and therefore he is the modern Bar Hedia. Isn't that interesting? So you have this book. It's probably not in circulation or print, but it's on HebrewBooks.org or one of these websites. Very, very interesting. I've read through a few little pages because it's all on site, and it's incredible. And everywhere, every third page is another dream of Herzl. Our bones will all rot before we will see any of this, etc. It's writing in 1899. It's not surprising, really, that these people believed this was completely out of the question, that would ever be a Zionist or a Hebrew Israeli state. But what is interesting is that he gave the book the main title, Bar Hedia. And this is just a subtitle, The Dream of Herzl. Okay, let's stop sharing. Okay. Right, so the Gemara has brought this machlokus between Bar Hedia and the others, and we said that essentially Bar Hedia was right, but the last statement made here was that Rovin and the others said that they even though it might have happened that Rosh Chodesh fell on such a day that the seventh day of Sukkot, Hoshana Rabbah, wasn't a Shabbos, they didn't allow the Arava to be taken. They didn't allow the Arava to be taken. So the Gemara asks on that basis, not on the basis that we know is correct, which is Bar Hedia, but on the basis that the seventh day of Sukkot, Hoshana Rabbah, can fall on the Shabbos, but they said don't go through the Arava ceremony. But Elakasha, it's difficult to know why. Why in Eretz Yisrael don't they take it on a Shabbos if we understand that Hoshana Rabbah can happen on a Shabbos, and if we're not concerned about the violation of Shabbos? Why don't we make this commemoration to what happened in the Beis HaMikdash? In the Beis HaMikdash, they took the Arava, the major Arava, if you like, on Shabbos. So why don't they also do it nowadays in Eretz Yisrael? So the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Yosef. And over here, you begin to see that there are big doubts creeping in as to what the whole Arava ceremony was in the Beis HaMikdash. I gave you this lovely picture of a large Arava hanging over. But there are big gaps in our knowledge of what this ceremony was. There's no real description. Yes, there's no eyewitness account that we have today of this Arava ceremony when the Mizbeach was around at the time of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef gave this as a possible reason why in Eretz Yisrael they don't take the commemorative Arava, if you like, Hoshana Rabbah Arava, if the seventh day falls on a Shabbos, because Man Leimalon Arava Binatila, Dilma Bisakifa, says Rav Yosef. Who says that the mitzvah of Arava was taking the Arava and then doing hakofas around the Mizbeach? Maybe that wasn't the mitzvah of the Arava at all. Maybe the mitzvah of the Arava was simply to place those large branches against the Mizbeach, which is the way I really described it to you last time. Let me just share screen again. Coming back to this wonderful picture again, we see in our Rava a very large myrtle. We have the Kohanim, these are clearly Kohanim. This is the Mizbeach, it's in the Beis HaMikdash. Rav Yosef is really saying, we don't really know what the original ritual was in the Beis HaMikdash. If you say that they actually went around the Mizbeach with these aravot, in other words, they had many of these aravot, they're just showing you one, and the Kohanim would go around 7 times or whatever, carrying these aravot. If you think that that is the case, maybe you're right. We should commemorate it today by doing our hakafot on Shmini on Hoshana Rabbah, by going around the bima 7 times with an arava, or with our lulav and esrog, or whatever it is, because that looks a little bit like the ceremony of Hoshana Rabbah in the Beis HaMikdash. Then we'll be commemorating, at least in a pale sense, we'll be commemorating the mitzvah of arava in the Beis HaMikdash. But maybe that wasn't it. Maybe the mitzvah of bizakifa, zokef, just erecting the aravot. So here you see the actual erection. Supposing the mitzvah arava really didn't require the Kohanim to go around the Mizbeach at all. The only thing it required was them to bring lots of these myrtle branches and to place them around the 4 sides, or maybe the 3, all the 4 sides apart from the ramp. Erect many of them overhanging the Mizbeach, and that was the ceremony. Now, if that's the case, says Rav Yosef, the reason that we don't take it on Shabbos is because what we do nowadays has no pictorial comparison to this ritual in the Beis HaMikdash. How can you say you're doing it Zeichen HaMikdash, that it commemorates it? If it's such a different practice, we don't have 15-foot high myrtles nowadays, which we use to overhang some large mizbeach in the shul. Find me a shul like that, and find me twigs and aravas. We don't do that at all. We do something so different. We walk around with very small little plants, and we walk around the bima in the middle 7 times. Now, if you say that's what they did with these large aravas as well, then at least we'll be doing something similar. But if we're not doing something similar at all, and all they did at the time of Mizbeach was to erect these tall plants around the Mizbeach and leave them there, and then not do any circumnavigation, then what we do nowadays is not a commemoration. And since it's not a commemoration, it's something completely different. Therefore, we don't do it if it falls on a Shabbos. We don't do it. We'd be prepared to do it if it was a real commemoration. But if it's not a commemoration at all, because it's so different, we don't do it. This is Rav Yosef's answer. That our ceremony today isn't like that at all. In fact, as you know, we do something even different today. Hoshana Rabbah today is very, very confusing. We don't walk around 7 times the bima with an arava at all. We walk around with our lulav and esrog. Of course, there's an arava, there are 2 aravas inside it, but those are not the same type of aravas. We don't walk around with our clapping aravas, do we? We don't. We go back to our desks and then clap after we've done seven circumnavigations. That's extremely different to this ceremony that we're suggesting was done in the Beis HaMikdash. We're getting further and further away. So what we do nowadays is very, very pale commemoration, and we're not even sure we know what was done at the time of the Beis HaMikdash. There's some mystical element in what was done in the Beis HaMikdash which we don't really know. And we don't do it today the same way. And therefore, we won't do it on the Shabbos. We'll only do things that we believe are really commemorating Zeichen HaMikdash. What is interesting today, of course, when we talk about what we do today, is our main thing on the Arava is when we finished all 7 times of Hashanas, we've gone around, we get back to our desks. The women won't know this because they don't go to shul. They just clap their aravas at home, but we clap our aravas, and that is to us is really almost like the whole essential Hoshana Rabbah, and we clap it. There are different minhagim 5 times or whatever. Where does this clapping come from? Where do we see any clapping here in this picture? Can you see them clapping in our rubber on the ground? Where on earth did this creep in? So you have to understand this chabita, as we call it, may only be from the time of the Gaonim. It's not clear where it comes from, and it's Kabbalistic, and that itself is a minhag. Maybe it's a minhag neviim. We'll talk a little bit about that later on, the clapping. And maybe, was it done at the time of the Gemara? It's not even clear how you interpret the Gemara. So what we understand to be the essential of Hoshana Rabbah, with a clapping of the Arava, of the special Aravas, are not anything like the ceremony over here on the 7th day of Sukkot that you see here. Even if we knew what it was exactly, we don't have the element of hitting any leaves against the ground and dislodging any leaves. That's something that has a completely separate identity to it. Okay, so I'm going to quit sharing now. Been quite a lot of information today. Let me stop recording. Don't know how to do that now.